Stop reacting, you stop explaining, you stop proving your worth, and suddenly they feel something they can't name, a loss of control without a clear trigger. This is where philosophy meets psychology. Human beings fear irrelevance more than rejection. Rejection still acknowledges impact. Irrelevance means you no longer shape the emotional landscape. When you grow, when you stabilize, when you become internally secure, you are no longer orbiting them. And that's when the avoidant feels the ground shift. They may not consciously say, I miss them. Instead, they feel restless, irritated, curious. Something doesn't resolve the way it used to. The silence didn't do that. Your evolution did. And here's the deeper layer most people miss. Avoidants are not avoiding love. They are avoiding the loss of identity that comes with emotional dependence. When they see you becoming whole without them, it confronts them with a terrifying question: was distance really strength, or was it protection? Silence never forces that question. Growth does, because growth reflects back something powerful. It says connection does not equal captivity. And that challenges the core belief system of an avoidant. Your calm, your groundedness, your lack of urgency, it destabilizes the story they've been telling themselves for years. So if you're thinking silence is the thing that will finally make them feel it, understand this: silence ends conversations, but growth ends illusions. Silence pauses the dynamic. Growth transforms it, and transformation is always more threatening than absence. You don't hurt an avoidant by disappearing. You disrupt them by becoming someone who no longer needs to disappear at all. Now let's go one layer deeper, because once you understand why silence doesn't work, you have to understand what really does, and that's where the power dynamic lives. Avoidant attachment is not just about fear of closeness, it's about control, not control in a manipulative, conscious way, but control as a survival strategy. Control over distance, control over timing, control over emotional exposure. And as long as that control remains intact, the avoidant stays regulated. Healing is the one thing that breaks that system. An avoidant feels safest when they can withdraw and still matter, when they can pull back and know on some level that you are still emotionally available, still affected, still waiting. Silence often preserves that. You're quiet, but you're still oriented toward them. You're not chasing, but you're paused. That pause becomes a form of power they don't even have to ask for. But healing changes the rules entirely. Healing means you stop negotiating for connection. You stop explaining your worth. You stop needing their recognition to validate your experience. And when that happens, the power dynamic collapses. Not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. Here's what's important to understand. Power in relationships doesn't come from who cares less. It comes from who is more emotionally self-contained. When you heal, you become internally sourced. Your sense of stability no longer depends on their availability. And the avoidant feels that immediately because their nervous system is highly sensitive to shifts in emotional dependency. They don't experience this as relief. They experience it as disorientation. Why? Because the avoidant identity is often built around being needed from a distance. They can offer just enough connection to remain central while staying protected from full emotional exposure. Your healing removes that middle ground. Suddenly, they are no longer the regulator of closeness. They are no longer the one who decides when intimacy starts and stops. You've taken your emotional authority back. And this is where discomfort begins. Not because you rejected them, but because you no longer require them. Avoidants are deeply uncomfortable when their absence no longer creates an emotional vacuum. When they pull away and nothing collapses, something inside them has to confront reality. They begin to question their significance, not in your life, but in the dynamic itself. And that question cuts far deeper than anger ever could. Most people think the way to hurt an avoidant is to make them feel abandoned. But abandonment is familiar territory for them, often rehearsed since childhood. What's unfamiliar is emotional redundancy, the realization that their withdrawal no longer changes your emotional state. That's the moment the power shifts. And notice something important here. You're not punishing them. You're not posturing. You're not winning. You're simply no longer participating in an imbalanced exchange. And that's what makes it so destabilizing. There's no conflict to resist, no drama to detach from, no intensity to justify withdrawal. There's just your grounded presence. This is where philosophy enters the conversation. Human beings construct identity around roles. The avoidance role is often the one who stays independent, the one who doesn't need much, the one who leaves first. But when you heal, that role loses its function. Independence only has meaning in contrast to dependence. When you are no longer dependent, their independence no longer distinguishes them. That's when self-reflection begins. Often quietly, often uncomfortably, they may feel pulled back toward you, not because they suddenly want intimacy, but because they feel the loss of influence. And influence, not closeness, is what maintains safety for them. Healing removes the leverage without confrontation. It dissolves the dynamic rather than attacking it. And that's why it works where silence fails. Silence keeps the structure intact. Healing makes it obsolete. So if you want to understand what truly impacts an avoidant, stop asking how to make them feel something. Start asking how to stop giving your emotional power away. Because the moment you reclaim it, the entire relationship rearranges itself, whether they're ready for it or not. And here's the closing truth to carry with you. You don't break the power dynamic by walking away in silence. You break it by becoming someone who no longer needs power at all. Once the power dynamic collapses, something even more unsettling begins to happen for the avoidant. And this is where most people completely misunderstand what they're reacting to. It's not your absence. It's not your words. It's not even the history you shared. What truly triggers an avoidant at this stage is your emotional consistency, your steadiness, your predictability. And that might sound strange because consistency is supposed to feel safe. But to an avoidant nervous system, consistency feels dangerous. Avoidants grow up learning that closeness is unstable. Love arrives unpredictably. Connection comes with emotional cost. So they adapt by staying fluid, by pulling away. Before anything becomes fixed, chaos becomes familiar, distance becomes regulation. In that internal landscape, emotional reliability isn't comforting, it's threatening, because reliability invites depth, and depth requires presence, and presence removes the option to disappear. When you become emotionally consistent, you stop swinging between longing and withdrawal. You stop reacting to their mixed signals. You stop needing reassurance one day and pulling away the next. Your emotional tone stays level. And what that communicates without you ever saying a word is, I am not controlled by uncertainty anymore. That message hits the avoidant at a subconscious level because unpredictability gave them leverage. It allowed them to stay ahead of intimacy. But consistency removes the chase. There's no emotional volatility to manage, no anxiety to soothe, no intensity to regulate. And suddenly, the avoidant has to face a version of closeness that doesn't come with chaos. That's terrifying to someone who has only ever known love as something that costs freedom. Here's the paradox. Emotional inconsistency often kept them comfortable. It gave them reasons to stay distant. Your steadiness takes those reasons away. When you show up grounded, calm, and emotionally available without pressure, their defenses don't know where to go. There's nothing to push against. No emotional storm to hide from, just clarity. And clarity forces self-awareness. Avoidants are not afraid of love itself. They're afraid of being required to show up fully in it. Emotional consistency sends a clear signal. Connection here does not demand self-erasure. And that challenges the core belief that closeness equals loss of autonomy. Your stable presence exposes the flaw in that belief more powerfully than any argument ever could. This is why secure energy is so disruptive. It doesn't ask. It doesn't chase. It doesn't threaten. It simply exists. And when it exists, the avoidant nervous system starts scanning for danger that isn't there. That internal mismatch creates anxiety. They feel unsettled, not because you're doing something wrong, but because their old coping strategies no longer apply. You might notice them becoming curious again, reaching out without clarity, testing the waters, or even pulling back further, trying to regain a sense of control. All of these are reactions to the same thing. Your emotional predictability removed their ability to define the terms of connection. And here's the deeper philosophical layer. Consistency represents truth. It says, this is who I am, regardless of your behavior. And truth is confronting because it reveals patterns without accusing them. Your calm exposes their avoidance without naming it. Your steadiness reflects their instability without judgment. And that mirror is uncomfortable to look into. Silence never creates that mirror. Silence leaves room for fantasy, projection, and denial. But consistency collapses illusion. It shows them that intimacy can exist without drama, that connection doesn't require control, and that realization threatens the identity they built around staying distant. This is why emotional consistency hurts more than silence ever could. Silence gives them space to retreat. Consistency removes the need to retreat at all. It says, I'm here and I'm not afraid. And that courage forces them to confront their own fear. So if you want to understand what truly impacts an avoidant, stop focusing on how quiet you are. Start focusing on how grounded you are. Because your calm is not neutral. Your stability is not invisible. It is a challenge, one that asks them to either grow or remain hidden. And here's the truth to leave with you, emotional. Consistency doesn't chase the avoidant. It exposes them. Indie exposure is far more unsettling than distance ever was. Now, here's where the shift becomes unmistakable. Because once your steadiness is established and the power dynamic has already changed, the avoidant expects something very specific from you. They expect resentment. They expect coldness. They expect punishment, distance, or at the very least, emotional bitterness. That expectation is part of how they stay oriented. It gives them a familiar emotional script to work with. And when that script doesn't appear, it unsettles them deeply. Most people believe that anger is what finally makes an avoidant feel regret. But anger is predictable. Anger confirms importance. Anger says, you mattered enough to hurt me. Coldness, sarcasm, or emotional withdrawal still revolve around them. Those reactions reassure the avoidant that the bond, however strained, still defines your emotional state. What truly disrupts them is something far quieter and far more powerful, your lack of resentment. When you move forward without bitterness, without the need to assign blame, without the urge to rewrite the past in order to feel justified, the avoidant loses their emotional reference point. There is nothing to push against, no conflict to detach from, no emotional charge to regulate, and that absence of resistance creates psychological dissonance. Because resentment allows avoidance to remain invisible. It lets them believe this fell apart because emotions were too intense. Your calm compassion tells a different story. It says this didn't fail because of emotion, it failed because of absence. And that truth is much harder to escape. From a psychological standpoint, avoidants are skilled at disengaging from overt conflict, but they struggle deeply with unresolved self-reflection. When you move on with clarity rather than contempt, you force them to confront the impact of their choices without the distraction of drama. There is no villain role to play, no narrative where they were pushed away by your intensity. Just the quiet awareness that you adapted, grew, and continued without them. And that's painful, not because they lost you, but because they lost the story that protected them. Philosophically, resentment is a form of attachment. It keeps the other person psychologically present. When you release resentment, you release the need for them to understand, apologize, or validate your experience. That is the moment when the avoidant realizes something unsettling. They no longer have emotional access to you. Avoidants often rely on lingering emotional ties to feel safe, even negative ones. They expect unresolved tension. They expect unfinished conversations. They expect to remain psychologically relevant. When you move forward without bitterness, you remove that relevance. Not through rejection, but through resolution. And resolution is the one thing avoidance cannot tolerate easily. You see, avoidance thrives in ambiguity, in gray areas, in maybe someday energy. Resentment keeps that ambiguity alive. It keeps the connection emotionally charged. Your peaceful detachment closes the loop. It signals that the relationship has been metabolized, understood, and integrated into your growth. That realization hits quietly, often later. They might replay interactions, wonder why you didn't react the way they expected, wonder why you didn't demand explanations or closure. And in that wondering, something uncomfortable surfaces, your strength, not performative strength, not defensive strength, but grounded self-respect. This is where regret begins, not as longing, but as recognition. Recognition that you didn't lose yourself. Recognition that they were not the emotional center they assumed they were. Recognition that you carried the relationship. IP forward internally while they stayed the same. Silence alone never produces that recognition. Silence leaves room for fantasy. Resentment leaves room for blame. But grace leaves only truth. And here's the most important part. Moving forward without bitterness is not something you do to teach them a lesson. It's something you do to reclaim your life. The impact it has on them is simply a byproduct of your integrity. So if you're wondering what really shocks an avoidant, understand this. It's not when you disappear in anger. It's when you walk forward in peace. And here's the closing truth to hold on to. When you let go without resentment, you don't just leave the relationship. You leave them with themselves. And that is the confrontation they can't escape. At this stage, something profound begins to happen inside the avoidant that they rarely talk about and often don't even consciously understand. When you embody secure energy, calm, self-directed, emotionally regulated, you don't just change the dynamic between you. You challenge the very identity they've built to survive. Avoidants often define themselves by autonomy. I don't need much. I value freedom. I'm independent. These aren't just preferences. They're psychological armor. Distance becomes proof of strength. Emotional restraint becomes proof of control. And as long as closeness feels chaotic or consuming, that identity remains unquestioned. But secure energy disrupts that narrative. When you are grounded without being distant, open without being needy, confident without being guarded, you present a version of connection that doesn't threaten freedom. And that creates internal conflict. Because if intimacy can exist without loss of self, then what exactly were they protecting all along? This is where the questioning begins, not outwardly, but internally. They start comparing your stability versus your restlessness, your emotional clarity versus their avoidance, your ability to stay present versus their reflex to disappear. And those comparisons are uncomfortable because they point toward a truth that challenges their self-concept. From a psychological perspective, identity is maintained by contrast. Avoidants feel independent because someone else is perceived as more emotionally invested. When you become secure, that contrast dissolves. You are no longer the one holding the emotional weight. And without that imbalance, their identity loses definition. This doesn't make them suddenly want commitment. It makes them uncertain. And uncertainty is far more destabilizing to an avoidant than longing. Longing can be dismissed. Uncertainty demands reflection. They may begin to feel something they've avoided for years, self-doubt. Not in a destructive way, but in a quiet, unsettling way. Questions surface. Why does closeness feel easier for them now? Why am I the one pulling away? What if the problem wasn't the relationship, but my response to it? Secure energy acts like a mirror that doesn't accuse, it doesn't confront, it simply reflects. And reflection is difficult to escape because there's no one to blame. Philosophically, this is the moment where freedom and avoidance get separated. True freedom is the ability to choose closeness or distance without fear. Avoidance is distance chosen out of fear. When you demonstrate emotional freedom, it exposes avoidance for what it really is, not strength, but protection. And that realization is painful because it forces a reevaluation of the past, the stories they told themselves to justify withdrawal, the moments they labeled as needing space, that were actually moments of emotional overwhelm. Your security reframes those memories without you ever mentioning them. This is why secure individuals are so confronting. They don't pressure avoidance to change. They don't demand intimacy. They simply live in a way that makes avoidance visible. Silence doesn't do that. Silence allows the avoidant to remain unchanged. Secure presence invites growth or reveals resistance to it. You may notice them oscillating, moving closer, then pulling back, expressing curiosity, then withdrawing. That instability isn't about you. It's the tension between who they believe they are and what your example suggests is possible. And here's the crucial insight. The discomfort isn't caused by losing you. It's caused by losing certainty about themselves. Identity disruption is one of the deepest forms of psychological pain because it threatens the coherence of the self. And when that coherence cracks, something has to give. Either the identity evolves or the defenses harden. You cannot control which path they choose, but you can understand why your secure energy matters so much. It doesn't chase. It doesn't convince. It simply demonstrates another way of being. And that demonstration lingers. Long after silence fades, long after conversations end, the image of you, grounded, whole, emotionally available without pressure, continues to work on them. Not as a memory of loss, but as a question they can't unask. So here's the truth to carry forward. Secure energy doesn't demand change from an avoidant. It invites it, and in that invitation, it reveals exactly who they are ready to become and who they are not. And now we arrive at the moment that truly seals the shift, the one that hurts the avoidant in a way silence never could. Not when you stop responding, not when you walk away, but when you no longer need closure. Most people underestimate how much avoidance rely on unresolved endings. Loose threads are comfortable for them. Ambiguity creates safety. A conversation left unfinished. An explanation never given. Emotions left hanging in the air. These allow the avoidant to stay psychologically connected without being emotionally exposed. As long as something remains unresolved, they don't have to fully feel, decide, or commit. Silence often keeps that door open. You stop speaking, but the ending remains unclear. There's still a maybe someday. Energy. Still an imagined future conversation. Still the possibility that things could be explained, repaired, or reopened. That ambiguity becomes a quiet form of protection for the avoidant. But when you reach closure internally, everything changes. Internal closure is not confrontation. It's not sending the final message. It's not demanding answers or accountability. It's the moment you understand the dynamic so clearly that you no longer need their participation to make sense of it. You stop asking why. You stop rehearsing what you would say if they came back. You stop holding emotional space for a conversation that may never happen. And the avoidant feels that shift, even if they don't know why, because unresolved endings keep them emotionally relevant. Closure removes relevance, not in a dramatic way, but in a final way. The emotional door isn't slammed, it's simply closed, quietly, firmly. And that's far more disorienting than rejection. From a psychological perspective, avoidants manage intimacy by controlling access. They decide when to engage and when to retreat. But when you no longer seek closure, you remove their final point of control. There is nothing left for them to regulate. No explanation to withhold, no response to delay, no moment to return to in order to feel significant. This is when the pain appears, not as longing, but as loss of access. They may reach out casually, test the waters, say something vague, not because they suddenly want closeness, but because they sense that something has shifted beyond their reach. And when those attempts don't restore the old dynamic, a deeper realization sets in. Your emotional world no longer includes them. Philosophically, closure is sovereignty. It's the decision to author your own emotional meaning. When you no longer require another person to validate your experience, you reclaim psychological author over your life. And authority is deeply unsettling to someone who relied on distance to feel powerful. Avoidants often believe they hold the ending, that they get to decide when things are over, when conversations resume, when meaning is assigned. Your internal closure quietly disproves that belief. It shows that endings don't require mutual agreement, only self-respect. And here's the most important distinction. You don't reach closure by hardening your heart. You reach it by understanding the pattern.